for day 2 of Lying in Politics. My name is Roger Berkowitz, director of the Arendt Center at Bard. I'm going to get off the stage very quickly and give us over to our speaker and chair today. But before I do, just a couple of brief introductory comments and thanks. First of all, I want to greatly thank Dick Bernstein and Dimitri Nagulin over at the New School in the Philosophy Department, who've been co-sponsoring this conference with us, and also Jerry Cohn, the director of the Hannah Arendt Center at the New School, who's been working with us for the last number of years at Bard, and really has been an amazing support and an advisor to us as we've tried to and now begun to make this center a reality and something that's doing, I hope, interesting things. And I appreciate you all being here on an early Saturday morning. I'm confident it will repay your diligence in getting up. I also need to thank a couple of people from Bard who have been incredibly helpful. Roshane McKenzie, a former student of mine, who will be starting at the London School of Economics in September, who's been in New York doing a lot of the logistics for this conference. And the fact that it's all run so well is, to a certain degree, large degree, due to her, and also to 2 of my research assistants, Margarita Fedorova and Will Anderson, who work with me up at Bard and have been incredible. Margarita has now, this is the 3rd conference that she has helped us organize, and she has become an incredible partner in organizing the center, so I need to thank her. But also just want to say there's a bunch of students who made it up here from Bard. I thank them for coming. And also Despina Duplantis, the administrative assistant in the New School of Philosophy Department, who's been very helpful as well. For those of you who were here or weren't here yesterday, we got off to a very good start. There's a number of themes that emerged in the conference on lying in politics, in addition to lying in politics. One that I think came up a lot, and we will focus on again much more later at the 4 o'clock panel, which all the speakers will be on, is the question of transparency, which we talked a bit about yesterday. Just to remind us of the theme, George Kateb gave a talk on the importance of transparency for democratic accountability, something that is undeniable, and he talked about the dangers of it as well and the limits of it, but the deep importance of transparency for accountability. Andreas Kalabowski told a story, I think attributed to Augustine and then also to Constant and Kant, that if someone comes seeking refuge and you give them refuge, the question is it okay to lie to protect them? This, of course, raises again the dangers of transparency. As I understand it, besides simply the danger to the person, transparency threatens hospitality. It threatens certain basic ideas of what unites us as people in the world and creates a common world in which we can live together. And Kirsty McClure specifically highlighted this precariousness of a common world in which we're in. A world threatened not only by transparency, but also by lying, by the loss of the factual and documentary truths, facts that create a common world. And I think one of the reasons that the Arendt's writing on lying in politics, which includes 2 essays directly lying in politics in the New York Review of Books, and lying and politics and truth, or truth in politics, published in the New Yorker, but also, as people mentioned throughout her work, especially in the origins of totalitarianism and other essays and in the human condition. The reason her work on her writing on lying in politics is so productive and interesting and relevant today is that it shows the dangers of both transparency and lying, and the need both to call lies lies, and show hypocrisy for hypocrisy. But the danger in pursuing hypocrisy too far and too much. And that's where a lot of her work on lying and politics gains its power, is through this ambiguity. The attack on ambiguity itself, she says, is destructive of politics. We need ambiguous institutions, like, for example, the Supreme Court, which has authority, in her mind, stretching back to its connection with the Roman Senate. And if you disambiguate the court through transparency and turn it into simply another political institution, it loses authority. And it's hard to have a meaningful politics without institutions that have authority, that don't come simply from majoritarian rule. One of the questions that this raises is, who can have authority in an age when we don't trust anyone? Who can be the truth teller? Is it academics? Is it scientists? Is it judges? And one of the reasons we're going to hear the talk today is by Uday Mehta, is he's going to talk about Gandhi and the possibilities of Gandhi as a truth teller. I'm going to leave the stage, and I'd like to introduce Chiara Bottici, who's at the New School, and she's going to introduce Uday Mehta. So I hope you have a great day. Thank you very much.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Uday Mehta. He's a distinguished professor at the Graduate Center at CUNY, City University of New York. He taught at a number of different places, among which I already mentioned Amherst College, University of Chicago, MIT, Cornell University, Columbia University. He's particularly known for his work on two books. The first is The Anxiety of Freedom, Imagination and Individuality in the Political Thought of John Locke, published in 1992. And for Liberalism and Empire, a study in 19th century British liberal thought, published by the University of Chicago in 1999, which has also been awarded, it was the winner of the David Grimstone Award in 2001 by the American Political Science Association. Professor Uday is currently working on two book projects, both relevant for the talk today, I guess. The first is called How Countries Relate to Their Past, a study of India, Israel, South Africa, and USA. And the second is called The Logic of War, Peace and Nonviolence. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking Roger and Bard and New School. Roger in particular for organizing yet another very interesting conference. That may change now. In any case, in her review of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, Hannah Arendt claimed that, and I quote, truthfulness has never been counted among political virtues, and lies have always been regarded as justifiable tools in political dealings, end of quote. Writing in the context of the Cold War, the war in Vietnam, and with an awareness of the history of totalitarianism, Arendt felt a deep ambivalence in affirming this troubling postulate of political thought and long-standing political practice. But affirm it she did. Her words capture an important idea with a long pedigree, namely that the justification of political events trumps truthfulness, so that lying, when it is politically warranted, becomes justified. The link between truth and politics, as Arendt discussed it, with characteristic insight and erudition in her earlier essay with that title, was as old as philosophy and politics themselves. In its original rendering in Plato, truth in its relationship to politics was doubly compromised. First, in the philosophic claim that even in the ideal polity, truth would have to be mingled with noble lies to meet the imperatives of politics. And second, in the fact that the embodiment of truth, Socrates, could only have survived the whims of the Athenian electors by reneging on the truth. What the Athenian citizens represented was not the inescapable pressure and presence of lies in sustaining the polis, but rather a disposition for being governed by mere opinions, ignorance, and a susceptibility to images. The citizens of the ancient polis, in Arendt's words, had, and I quote, a perverse love for deception and falsehood. In Greek political thought, and with redoubled emphasis in modern political thought, the very sort of human existence that political life offered was one in which truth would be, at best, secondary to that form of existence. But unlike in Plato's Republic, where the love of falsehood did not stem from any fear or threat to the community, fear of enemies, I mean, or threat to the community, in the modern tradition, it is precisely this fear and threat, along with the ways in which it disseminates itself into the governing norms of the domestic community, that have served as the main grounds for the latitude that political society has given to lies and, as it turns out, to violence. In this paper, I want to do two things. First, I want to consider the question, what is it about political ends and the form of existence that it offers, or at least promises, that allows it to justifiably overwhelm the expectation of truthfulness, so that the moral and epistemic qualities of truth become secondary to that form of existence. And then I want to reflect on what politics would have to be if it were the sort of activity that was constrained by the truth, rather than being in a position to always overwhelm it. The first question relates to Arendt's idea that truth is not, in her view, never has been, a political virtue. And the second, to the conditions under which it could or might be such a virtue. I should make clear that in this context, my conception of virtue is simply something one endorses unconditionally, without regard to the harms or benefits that may stem from it. It is what Kant calls a duty. Precisely because Arendt takes the position that she does regarding the first question, she does not engage the second. This is not to say that she affirms falsehood as a positive value. She certainly does not. Nor does she believe that truthfulness is of limited importance as a value. On this too, she was explicit, that she could countenance a world without freedom and justice, or a world in which freedom and justice were sacrificed, but not one in which truth was. Despite that, truth could not, for Arendt, be a political virtue. There was something ultimately otherworldly about it. It inhibited the human desire to act in concert, to appear in public, to do great deeds, and to change the world in light of our ideals. In brief, it went contrary to our desire to be political actors, bent on changing the world and, as she said, beginning something entirely new. The agonism and flux of political life which Arendt celebrated existed by her own admission under a sky of unchanging verities. But in terms of the everyday life, the rays of those verities were heavily refracted as they entered the political domain. In this sense, Arendt supported Plato in his account of the highest transcendent ground of reality, which he associated with truth, while siding with Aristotle on the middle ground of collective human existence. This latter space, she believed, was irredeemably political, and it is here that truth could not be a virtue because it would always be shunned by political rationale and political justification. Both the questions I consider in this paper turn on justification. That is to say, what is it about politics that justifies lies, so that truth cannot be a political virtue? And second, what would justify truth being of such an order that it could trump rather than be subservient to political rationality? In addressing the first of these questions, I offer a rather abstract account of the basis of political society and political rationality in the modern tradition of political thinking to explain the relationship of politics with lying. The account I give is abstract because it must meet a correspondingly abstract challenge that truth cannot be a political virtue. The claim, after all, is not that it cannot be a virtue in patently deceitful regimes, but rather that truth loses its justification as a virtue in political societies as such. With regard to the second question, I focus on Gandhi. Gandhi plainly did not accept a subsidiary status for truth. The term satyagraha, which is the caption to his various forms of activism and to the form of existence that he avowed, is best translated as steadfastness in holding on to the truth. It was a steadfastness that he advocated in the context of numerous mass public actions within the more sequestered domain of the ashram and to individuals who sought his counsel. Whether the forms of activism that Gandhi endorsed should be thought of as political is an issue to which I will return in the conclusion. The question I consider is, what are the implications of having a steadfast conception for the familiar view we have of political society and political action? To anticipate the argument I make, it is that in the modern tradition of political thinking, the justificatory ground for lying and violence, and of course much else, is the professed security of the community, in principal part because it is taken to be the best guarantor of the highest value, namely human life. I say professed because neither lying nor violence may, as a general matter, in fact serve the end of serving, serve the end of securing the political community or human life. But to the extent that a claim can be made to that effect, they meet the challenge of justification because they can be identified as serving the highest value of life. In this broad political orientation, there is no foundational value attached to truth, which is not to say that there is no value attached to it. In contrast, Gandhi places a value on truth that is entirely independent of any form of existence. He associates truth with the metaphysical form of being, with God and with sacrifice, but not with securing of life. For Gandhi, truth was an absolute. Hence, no form of existence, neither individual nor collective, could be an alibi for it. So let me move to this abstract account. In the history of Western political thought from the 17th century onwards, one can identify at least 3 points of emphasis that persist into the contemporary era and which have retained their salience during the intervening 3.5 centuries. They constitute the main bases of political society and a principal feature of the rationality that courses through its functioning, that is to say, the mode of its justification. The first is the idea that political society offers the only reasonable redress to the insecurity, fear, and the prospect of violence, which individuals in its absence would have good reasons to expect. Second, that political society, once it is formed, must itself expect to be the object of competition and potentially of violence from other political societies, and therefore must have the resources to contend with this insecure and permanent condition. Third, political societies, in best dealing with this predicament and with the other exigencies of politics, including domestic threats, must be unified, and hence there is something in the nature of a political imperative to cultivate this unity. The first idea recalls the state of nature which Hobbes identified as a condition of extreme corporeal vulnerability which neither moral regulation, social conventions, or individual volition could ameliorate. The decisive feature of this condition was not natural death along with the anxiety that it might engender, but rather death that was violent and painful, the product of fierce competition, scarcity, and disarrayed passions. Such a death had as its subjective analog a condition of universal and acute fear. One of Hobbes' many achievements was to have normalized the expectation of such a death in an unregulated condition and the fear that was precedent on it or to it. Correspondingly, it was one of his achievements to have given corporeal life and its preservation a primacy and to have associated the redress of that unacceptable condition with political society. In Locke, notwithstanding the existence of a moral community of humankind anchored in natural law and natural rights and social institutions such as the family and private property, the natural state was nevertheless liable to unsettling forms of uncertainty and inconvenience, which would lead to insecurity and ultimately in a context in which, again, fear and violence were endemic. The second idea underlies the pervasive view that political society, even though it is formed as a redressing response to the violence and insecurity of the natural state, cannot itself, at a foundational level, forego the use of violence because of the interstate predicament of insecurity into which it is thrust. Moreover, it cannot forego the use of violence because violence is an essential feature of the power through which political society secures domestic peace, administers justice, and furthers the public interest. The third idea expresses the thought that whatever the social, ethnic, cultural, geographical, or other forms of diversity and unity that might characterize a collection of individuals, they must, in addition, be forged into a people with a distinctive political self-conception or collective identity. A central feature of that political identity, even if it involves a shared and founding allegiance to certain inalienable rights and abstract normative principles, as the American Act of Separation did, is an awareness that they constitute one body with a shared vulnerability. The forging of a distinct political identity, even in a text like the American Declaration of Independence, in which the appeal to normative principles was so conspicuous, explicitly stipulated the need, and now I quote, to provide new guards for their future security and to have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all the other things, acts and things which independent states may of right do, end of quote. The declaration did not just indicate a desire to defect from George III's empire. It was a document that professed the formation of something separate, singular, and unified, bound together in part by a shared insecurity, along with the means to contend with that predicament. Hobbes signals the significance of this metamorphosis of individuals into one body by invoking the gravity of the biblical term covenant, thereby associating the formation of the Commonwealth with a new communion and a radically transformed ontological condition. In brief, unity and the diversity of the social, be it the bonds of the family, religious orders, professional guilds, territorial and functional forms of association, such as towns and villages, none of these can serve as a substitute for the unity of the political. The third idea anticipates a history in which the formation of modern political societies was linked as both cause and effect with patriotism, and with the thought that each member was communally linked with every other member, and that the nature of this link was especially poignant because of the issue of security, defense, and the preservation of the corporate body of the people was always at risk. One might say in this tradition, security and self-preservation are literally obsessions, in that no amount of attending to them fully assuages the anxiety that they represent. Even in thinkers like Rousseau and Kant, who endorse a federative ideal, there is no relaxing on the importance of patriotism, notwithstanding the civic accent that is placed on it. Related to the third idea was the emphasis that political societies placed on territorial and other forms of boundaries, which were to be rigid and not porous. Hegel, in summarizing the broad orientation of modern political thought and practice, Hegel was summarizing the broad orientation of modern political thought and practice when he wrote, and I quote, "Individuality is awareness of one's existence as a unit in sharp distinction from others. It manifests itself here in the state as a relationship with other states, each of which is autonomous vis-à-vis the other." End of quote. And finally, the third idea points to the thought that in political society there must be a central source of power, even if that power is limited or checked by contesting divisions and established norms for the transfer of power. All three of these ideas are commonplace. They give us an account in which the principal ground of politics is a sense of acute physical vulnerability at both the individual and collective level. The principal motive for its formation is fear, and the overriding concern with self-preservation, again, both individual and collective. The fact that politics is also associated with other imperatives, such as justice, enhanced material well-being, or in the democratic tradition, with the establishment of institutions that give expression to the idea of individuals as free and equal, or that the power of the state should be limited and accountable, does not undermine the claim that an important tradition of modern political thought has been guided by Hobbes' rendering of the Latin expression salus populi suprema lex esto, where salus no longer referred to salvation, but rather to the safety of the people, safety of individuals, and more importantly, the security of political society as a whole. At the risk of overstatement and historical privileging, one might say that the trauma of the English Civil War, the attendant struggles over crown, court, and country, and the decades in the 16th and 17th centuries of internecine religious conflict over much of the expanse of Europe, all of which did so much to discredit the social as the ground of identity and as a self-subsistent order, and which correspondingly raised to the status of an imperative the need for a distinctly political society anchored in fear and an obsessive concern with security, have cast a long shadow on the past 3.5 centuries. That, by the way, was my attempt to write a sentence like Isaiah Berlin's. The resulting primacy of the political can be assessed not merely by the common claim that everything is political, but also in the fact that the determination of the non-political falls exclusively within the competence of the political. Hobbes may have been wrong to have believed that only a singular and absolute sovereign with the awesome power to tame a generalized fear in the population could hold together a political society with the appropriate level of unity. But in the salience of fear and the high value placed on unity to political society, he has been substantially vindicated, and that too over a range of different regimes. In this abstract and no doubt overly simplified overview of the broad strokes of modern political thought, I have emphasized 3 things as characterizing both the cause and effect of political society and its rationale. They are fear, a concern with security, and the foundational value placed on unity. I have emphasized these because they constitute the basis of why truth has not and cannot be in this tradition a political virtue. As John Mersheimer has emphasized in his recent book, Why Leaders Lie, and as Cicela Bock did in her book on lying, the most pervasive motive for lying in politics is a professed concern with the security and unity of the polity. Mersheimer makes the related point that such lies, even though they claim as a primary reason the presence of an imminent external threat, are really directed at the domestic citizenry, in whom the fear of political insecurity has been cultivated and in whom it has taken root. Indeed, he makes the interesting point that leaders as a general matter tend not to lie to leaders of other countries. Not surprisingly, such lies become the warrant for other lies, as they did conspicuously in the war in Vietnam. Here, in fact, was the working of a domino effect at the expense of truth and in the public realm, where security and the unity of political society are foundational values. Lies, like violence, always have a conditional justification. Within this orientation, there is always some future eventuality with respect to which a lie can be politically justified. For the remainder of this paper, I want to reflect on what the implications might be if none of the 3 ideas that I have associated with modern politics were held to be true or normatively credible. I do this by considering Gandhi's thought and writings, and to a lesser extent, his actions. I deflate the role of his actions because to understand them fully, one would need to consider their surrounding historical context. That is neither appropriate to my competence nor to the specific purpose I have in mind. I wish to take Gandhi seriously as a thinker because I believe he was a very serious thinker and a very interesting thinker. But since he was also a figure of great historical importance, it is quite dissatisfying to largely ignore his historical role. I think the best way to deal with this is to acknowledge the fact or the charge and then to move on. At any rate, in terms of his thoughts and writings, there is good and ample reason to believe that Gandhi did not subscribe to any of the three ideas I have outlined as being central to modern political thought and practice. Regarding the first idea, he did not think that corporeal vulnerability was in need of redress. Its existence was an ineradicable fact of life, subject to contingency and moral response. He embraced the fact and the contingency and made it the very ground for crafting a morally meaningful response. The central feature of this moral response was an unconditional endorsement of the truth. He emphasized that the etymology of the word satya, truth, came from sat, namely to be, which referred to absolute being and hence to God. Hence truth called for a kind of devotion. He certainly did not believe that the only redress to the fact of vulnerability and fear of death was the formation of political society. Instead, he accepted the fear that came with vulnerability by transmuting it into the demand for courage. Courage in which there was a permanent willingness to surrender or sacrifice one's life. In doing so, he blunted what I have identified as the principal motive of political society, fear and the prospect of security. For Gandhi, and he emphasized this literally hundreds of times, the individual and collective analog to truth was courage. As he said, quote, "The path of truth is for the brave alone, never for a coward." Courage, while it blunts the motive for political society, also extends the ambit of moral action to everyday life. One must, for Gandhi, always be prepared to sacrifice one's life for moral action. This is why the scene of battle, be it the fratricidal war at the heart of the Mahabharata, the Boer War, the First World War, or the Jewish predicament in the Second World War, all constitute exemplary sites of moral action for Gandhi. But he was drawn to the battlefield because it exemplified something commonplace for him. It was the model of everyday life, not the exceptional predicament against which to construct a political refuge. It could serve as such a model because the fact of violence and insecurity were themselves facts of everyday life, not something that could be quarantined or pacified by political society or anything else. The very ubiquity of violence in the natural state, which for Hobbes served as the ground for a sequestration of the social from the political and a presumption in favor of the logic of the latter, for Gandhi served as the basis for articulating the universality of ethics in which truth was at its center. Consider Gandhi's interpretation of Arjun's dilemma in the Battle of Kurukshetra, when his will to fight his kinsman was deserting him. This is the scene from the Mahabharata that is so important to Gandhi, where cousins are fighting and Arjun's charioteer is Lord Krishna, and Arjun is losing his will to fight because if he fights, he's going to kill his kinsman. So this is Gandhi. Let us suppose that Arjun flees the battlefield. Though his enemies are wicked people, are sinners, they are his relations, and he cannot bring himself to kill them. If he leaves the field, what would happen to those vast numbers on his side? If Arjun went away, leaving them behind, would the Kauravas, that's the other side, have mercy on them? If he left the battlefield, the Pandav army, that's Arjun's side, would simply be annihilated. What then would be the plight of their wives and children? If Arjun had left the battlefield, the very calamities that he feared would have befallen them. Their families would have been ruined. The traditional dharma of these families and the race would have been destroyed. Arjun, therefore, had no choice but to fight. 2 points are significant here. First, Gandhi does not see Arjun's actions or inactions as diminishing the fact of war or violence. In either event, war and violence persist. As with non-violence, so too with Arjun's actions in the battlefield. They do not intervene to quell or sequester the fact of violence. Second, on Gandhi's rendering, Arjun had no choice but to fight, because violence itself was written into the situation. The resolution of Arjun's dilemma could not be settled by choice in the ordinary sense, where ethics stemmed from an amplitude of alternative possibilities, but rather by the moral meaning of his actions under conditions where precisely such amplitude was absent. He could act in a way to retain moral meaning so that the act was not instrumentally linked to some future condition, but instead was backed by a personal comportment that was attentive to the present. The act had to be moral and truthful without relying on any alibi from the future. Indeed, by invoking the effect that Arjun's flight would have on the wives and children of his kinsmen, Gandhi means to associate morality not with a heroic condition, but with the most commonplace facts of social life. It is striking that Gandhi should offer the mundane, the almost banal social fact of Arjun's being a brother-in-law and uncle as being motivationally relevant to his joining such a momentous battle between the forces of righteousness and those of evil. Gandhi accepted the battlefield and the fact of violence as a quotidian thing that required an exacting, but again, quotidian courage, while the tradition of politics identified it as an exceptional condition, but one to which it gave a permanent and even qualified warrant. For Gandhi, the battlefield functions as the crystallization of a sight that calls for fearlessness and courage, which for him was the essence of truthfulness and virtue. The demand for security is thus the demand of a deserter seeking to flee the battle and not being prepared to sacrifice him or herself. It is important to recall that Gandhi reserved his highest admiration for sacrificial figures like King Harishchandra, who was prepared to sacrifice his long sought-after only son to fulfill a promise made to the gods who had facilitated the son's birth. Even the much invoked king of Ayodhya, Ram, is celebrated as a quotidian figure, as a son, brother, father, husband, who was prepared to banish and see his wife suffer and die in the name of duty. Gandhi seldom mentions the nature of his rule as a king in the privileged location of Ayodhya, the capital of his realm. What he always singles out is the quality of his sacrifice. Gandhi himself would have gladly assumed that role, as he made clear in his autobiography, and would have allowed his own wife to die by denying the beef broth on which, according to the attending physician, her life depended, her survival depended. Gandhi's life is replete with examples of his own willingness to die. Indeed, it has often been pointed out that by spurning the police security detail that was urged upon him in the fractious months of 1948, he all but invited the death that ultimately felled him. The willingness to be sacrificed was next only to the requirement of truthfulness, or absolute truthfulness, which Gandhi made of all the satyagrahis. They had to be prepared to die without resorting to violence or killing. Even in this demand, Gandhi vouched for the ordinary. After all, the satyagrahis were ordinary folks, yet Gandhi thought them capable of the ultimate sacrifice, fearlessness and courage, and that which truth entailed. And that too, without assuring them even a hint of security. So he demanded that the satyagrahis be prepared to do this, and instead he said, you get no security. That's what truth demands. But nowhere was Gandhi's call for sacrifice more audacious and controversial in what he said than what he said he would do if he were a Jew in Germany, faced with the genocidal might of Hitler and the Nazis. Writing in November 1938 in the journal Harijan, in response to letters that had sought his views on what was happening in Germany and Palestine, Gandhi responded in words that deserve to be quoted at length. I'll do that. By the way, this is not a translation, it was written in English. The nobler cause would be to insist on a just treatment of the Jews, wherever they are born and bred. Jews born in France are French, in precisely the same sense that Christians born in France are French. If the Jews have no home but Palestine, will they relish the idea of being forced to leave the other parts of the world in which they are settled? Or do they want a double home where they will remain at will? This cry of a national home affords a colorable justification of the German expulsion of Jews. But the German persecution of Jews seems to have no parallel in history. The tyrants of old never went so mad as Hitler seems to have gone. And he is doing it with religious zeal. For he is propounding a new religion of exclusion and militant nationalism, in the name of which any inhumanity becomes an act of humanity to be rewarded here and hereafter. The crime of an obviously mad but intrepid youth is being visited upon this whole race with unbelievable ferocity. If ever there could be a justifiable war in the name of humanity, a war against Germany to prevent the wanton persecution of the whole race, would be completely justified. But I do not believe in any war. A discussion of the pros and cons of such a war is therefore outside my horizon or province. Germany is showing to the world how efficiently violence can be worked when it is not hampered by any hypocrisy or weakness masquerading as humanitarianism. It is also showing how hideous, terrible, and terrifying it looks in its nakedness. Can the Jews resist this organized and shameless persecution? Is there a way to preserve their self-respect and not to feel helpless, neglected, and forlorn? I submit there is. If I were a Jew and born in Germany and earning my livelihood there, I would claim Germany as my home, even as the tallest Gentile German might, and challenge him to shoot me or cast me into a dungeon. I would refuse to be expelled or submit to discriminating treatment. And for doing this, I should not wait for the fellow Jews to join me in civil resistance, but would have the confidence that in the end, the rest were bound to follow my example. If one Jew or all the Jews were to accept the prescription here offered, he or they cannot be worse off than now. And suffering voluntarily undergone will bring them an inner strength and joy which no number of resolutions of sympathy passed in the world outside of Germany can. Indeed, even if Britain, France, and America were to declare hostilities against Germany, they can bring no inner joy, no inner strength. The calculated violence of Hitler may even result in a general massacre of the Jews by way of his first answer to the declaration of such hostilities. But if the Jewish mind could be prepared for voluntarily suffering, even the massacre I have imagined could be turned into a day of thanksgiving and joy that Jehovah had wrought deliverance of the race, even at the hands of a tyrant. End of quote. Not surprisingly, Gandhi's works provoked uproar and controversy. But they deserve to be considered carefully. There are two broad issues that Gandhi refers to in his statement. First is that of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine, and the second of German Jews' response to the barbarity of Hitler. For Gandhi, the two issues were linked, but I will consider them separately. Regarding the second issue, Gandhi's suggestion was that were he a Jew, born, bred, and earning his livelihood in Germany, that is to say, if he were a German in the most mundane and social sense of the term, he would defy the discriminatory racial laws at the risk of being imprisoned and killed. Gandhi's suggestion is implicit in the very question he asks. it is not the question of how can German Jews survive in a corporeal sense, but rather how can they preserve their self-respect and not feel helpless, neglected, and forlorn. He would refuse to be expelled. That is to say, he would refuse to be forcibly made into a deserter from the scene of the battle for self-respect. He would stand up to the tallest German Gentile, that is, refusing to concede that race, religion, and law should define a homeland. He would act alone, but with the full confidence that his example would be followed by other Jews, without even advocating such concurrence. He would, that is, refrain from transforming the singular moral act into a collective strategic political act. He would even spurn the support of Britain, France, and America, knowing that such support can at best be for his security and not for the inner joy and strength that motivates and gives meaning to his actions. 3 years earlier, in 1935, while writing about the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, Gandhi made a similar point. He had associated the strength of the Abyssinians with their not offering armed resistance to the invasion, and in making no appeal to the League of Nations or any other power for armed intervention. He went so far as to say that precisely by not offering armed resistance would the Abyssinians deny the Italians what they sought, which was not their land, but their submission. Gandhi would act with a full measure of self-confidence, knowing as a religious man that his God would not forsake him. And finally, as with his counsel to Arjun, he had no choice but to, who had no choice but to fight, he would do all of this without believing that his actions would leave the Jews with respect to the violence that would be visited on them any better or worse off. The act of self-sacrifice would thus have been relieved of the incalculable effects of its external implications. It would literally be autonomous. It would literally be an autonomous act. That is to say, self-legislative, indifferent to the world of appearance, and all this having relied only on the most mundane social fact, namely the location of one's birth and livelihood. Like Arjun, whose call to moral action was rooted in the everyday concern for wives and children of his kinsmen, Gandhi, as a German Jew, would find his motivation for the ultimate bodily sacrifice in an inescapable, prosaic everyday reality. I was born here, I live here. There was, as George Orwell rightly noticed in his review of Gandhi's autobiography, something profoundly democratic in his exacting moral standards. One can easily imagine Gandhi being deeply impressed by stories of knights in shining armor performing acts of great valor, and thinking that they were written for him, for people like him, who hardly wore any clothes and came from the most middling of backgrounds. As I've said, I think, as an aside, I should say that Orwell places the accent in the wrong place by characterizing Gandhi's counsel to Jews living in Germany as being a call for collective suicide. For Gandhi, the difference between collective suicide and conscious individual self-sacrifice was nothing less than the former being a political and strategic act, while the latter was a moral act. The other matter Gandhi refers to in his statement relates to the issue of a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. But it captures his broader view on the sort of unity that a political homeland must evince. Gandhi was aware that in seeking a homeland in Palestine, the Jews were seeking a national state anchored in the exclusive particularities of their religion. They were like the Muslim League in its advocacy of Pakistan. Gandhi was confirmed in this equivalence by the frequency with which Jinnah and the Pakistani state, without any sense of irony, invoked Theodor Herzl's pamphlet, The Jewish State. But more relevantly for Gandhi, this demand made Jews in a very peculiar way analogous to Hitler and the Germans, whose ideology he identified as a form of exclusive religious nationalism. The demand for a Jewish state was thus vindicated the exclusionary laws that mandated the expulsion of Jews from Germany or wherever they lived. The claim of exclusivity when backed by a religious and national form could not be squared with the idea of Jews being at home in different places or wherever they happened to live. If the nation state, with its assurance of security for its exclusive members, was the appropriate mode of existence for particular religious groups, then, at the limit, the demand for a Jewish state vindicated, as he said, Nazi inhumanity, which professed to be an act of humanity. If the appropriate destiny of human beings was to be organized into political nation states, then the inhumanity visited on them to achieve this would, at a minimum, have considerable normative and political credence. That is precisely the form of life that Gandhi wished to challenge. It is the specifically political sort of unity, the making of one people, a body politic, which Gandhi viewed with deep suspicion because he saw in it a concern with corporeality that could never resolve itself into a fearlessness that truth required, because it was from the outset concerned with the preservation of life and security and not with the conditions of moral action. To the extent that such unity valued sacrifice, no, let me skip that. Gandhi's point here as elsewhere was different. It was to draw attention to a kind of specifically political unity which, by its emphasis on collective security of an exclusive group and the rigidity of borders and territorial markers that singled out that group, evacuated the everyday conditions of truthful moral action. Those conditions for Gandhi belonged to the unity and the diversity of the social, to the arbitrary conditions that human beings found themselves in, to the places where they lived, to the places where they were born, lived, and worshipped. Jews living in France or in Germany, Muslims who had Hindu neighbors with different dietary taboos, or Indians living in South Africa. He associated the social and not the idealism of the political with the conditions that made truth and through it moral action possible. Nationalism, by vouching for a different kind of community, displaced the moral imperative which was nestled in the contingent particularities of everyday life, with an imperative in which one was to die and kill for the political community. Finally, by way of conclusion, let me return to Arendt and the question of truth and its relationship to politics, while keeping Gandhi in mind. At the end of her essay, Truth and Politics, Arendt considers what she calls the standpoint outside the political realm. For her, that standpoint is associated with the philosopher, the scientist, the artist, the historian, the judge, the fact finder, the witness, and the reporter. What they all shared, when described as such, was that they had no political commitment, no adherence to a cause that involved human beings acting in concert in light of their ideals for a public purpose. Gandhi, I've been arguing, very self-consciously also spurned a political orientation, but he does not do so on account. But he does not, on account of that, recede from the public or from great public causes. Indeed, one might say that he has a claim that more than any other single individual, he has a claim to have, more than even Lenin and Mao, to have brought the common man and woman into the fold of public life on terms that were marked by a singular absence of hierarchy, prescriptive authority, and the condescension of political parties and elites. He did this while being a profound critic of politics. That is, politics conceived in terms of the motive of fear and the redressing of corporeal insecurity through the medium of the unity of political power. For Arendt, this was a near impossibility. Just about everywhere that Arendt mentions Gandhi, she views him through the narrow lens of nationalism in its struggle with empire. In effect, she politicizes Gandhi by association. In doing so, I think she misunderstands Gandhi by making him into an unusual version of something very familiar, namely a political actor. Unusual simply because he used non-violent means. Of course, Gandhi was a profound critic of the British Empire. But because of the form of power that empire exercised, and not because he thought there was something wrong in the British being in India or elsewhere. He did not. He made that clear. The British were welcome to stay. As late as 1943, he told the Viceroy, and I quote, "This is as much your country as mine. You live here too." Karl Jaspers, in his book, The Atomic Bomb and the Future of Man, had a slightly different and more capacious take on Gandhi than Arendt. Even though Jaspers also accepted the postulate, and I quote, that the essence of politics is association with force employed for self-preservation, when faced with Gandhi's achievement, he demurred to the interrogative form. Speaking of Gandhi, he said, quote, he wanted the impossible, politics by non-violence. He had the greatest possible success, the liberation of India. Is the impossible possible after all? He concluded. Nowhere, to the best of my knowledge, did Gandhi emphasize the importance of forging a unitary people obsessed with their individual or collective security. In all the ways that mattered to him, the conditions for meaningful moral action were ready at hand. As he said, the opportunity for virtuous behavior comes to almost everyone every day. Those conditions were diverse and mundane rather than exclusive, social rather than national, attentive to the present rather than the future, in a space that was porous rather than well-defined. They involved an individual tenacity and self-awareness rather than the idealism on behalf of a unified collectivity. Under those conditions, truth could indeed be a virtue, exemplified by large numbers of individuals, even while acting in concert. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Uday Mehta, for this challenge.